The morning was strangely quiet in Ouagadougou. No headlines, no warnings, just the low hum of army trucks rolling through narrow streets. It was 7 a.m. when boots struck the pavement and soldiers surrounded an unmarked office building. Inside, boxes of files, encrypted phones, and humming servers were swiftly removed. To the outside world, it looked ordinary, but for Burkina Faso, it was the moment the silence broke. For years, outsiders treated Africa like a chessboard, moving pieces without asking the people who lived on the board. Burkina Faso had been no exception. Contracts were signed, resources drained, and intelligence networks dug deep into the nation's soil. The cause was simple. When a country stays quiet, others take advantage. The consequence, as every elder knows, is that silence becomes consent. But that morning, the cycle ended. By noon, President Ibrahim Traoré appeared before the press. No shouting, no grandstanding. Just one measured line. Africa is not your blind spot anymore. It was more than a statement. It was an act of cause and effect. Years of exploitation had created anger. Anger demanded action. Action would now set off ripples across West Africa. Crowds began gathering in the capital. Mothers with children, students carrying signs, elders nodding in agreement. They spoke not of revenge but of dignity reclaimed. It was as if a curtain had lifted, exposing what many already felt, that their sovereignty had been rented out for too long. The karmic lesson was visible. When you sow control, you reap resistance. Yet, the question hung heavy in the air. Was this the birth of a new African era, or the first step into a storm? History shows that every choice has its price. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, the world began to wonder what consequences would follow next. It began as a single operation in Ouagadougou, but by 9 in the morning, 6 more offices across Burkina Faso had been raided, servers unplugged, hard drives sealed, and accounts frozen. These were not random businesses. Investigators tied them to covert surveillance networks with links to Israeli defense firms. For years, they had collected data, mapping not just communications, but the very pulse of West Africa. The cause was secrecy. The consequence was exposure. Once uncovered, the web collapsed in hours. At noon, the message became official. Every contract involving Israeli defense or cybersecurity services was terminated immediately. Drone programs suspended, software licenses revoked, intelligence sharing agreements cancelled. Ministries received the order in writing. End cooperation now. It was precise and disciplined. No bullets fired, no riots in the streets. A doctrine was forming, later called the Traoré Doctrine. Reject silent domination. Reclaim sovereign choice. The karmic balance was clear. Decades of foreign intrusion had brought years of quiet dependence. Now the reaction had come, not as chaos but as structure. Internationally, the effect was instant. Within 72 hours, Mali froze its own imports of Israeli defense technology. Guinea followed, suspending cyber contracts. Niger announced an audit of foreign mining and data firms tied to external intelligence. 3 countries in 3 days, like dominoes falling. The West African firewall had begun. Here, the cause and effect chain became undeniable. One young leader's defiance turned into a regional movement. When we look back at Burkina Faso's bold turn under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, we see more than politics. We see a lesson in cause and effect, in karma that speaks to every generation and every family. A nation long treated as a silent piece on a global chessboard finally stood up. The cause was years of exploitation and quiet neglect. The consequence was a collective awakening that cannot be easily reversed. Karma teaches us that nothing in life happens in isolation. Choices carry weight, even when they seem small at the time. For decades, foreign governments signed contracts, drained resources, and told themselves Africa would remain quiet. But silence does not mean acceptance. Silence, over time, becomes a seed of resistance. In the same way, when families ignore problems, when communities let small injustices slide, the harvest eventually arrives. The weeds grow if we do not tend the field. In Burkina Faso, the weeds of neglect grew into anger. But that anger, transformed into action, became dignity. The karmic balance is clear. When injustice is sown, dignity eventually rises to claim its place. And so the story is not only about Africa, it is about all of us. Because every community, whether in Ouagadougou or in a small town in Ohio, faces the same law of consequence. Think of your own life. What happens when a neighbor helps you in times of need? That kindness ripples forward. What happens when bitterness or resentment is left unchecked? That too multiplies. Karma is not a mystical idea. It is the simple truth that actions create outcomes, just as seeds create harvests. And like the farmers of Burkina Faso, we all must choose what seeds we plant. For older generations in America, this lesson feels especially close. Many of you have lived through times when communities were stronger, when neighbors looked out for each other. You know what it feels like to sow responsibility and reap stability. But you also know the pain of seeing communities fracture, families drift apart, or values erode. These are karmic outcomes too, the fruits of choices made or avoided. Burkina Faso's choice reminds us that dignity is never given. It is earned and then protected. The same is true for families. If we want our children to inherit strength, we must live with integrity today. If we want communities safe, we must show responsibility now. The law of cause and effect does not wait for tomorrow. It shapes the future with every decision we make today. The story also reminds us of resilience. When foreign contracts were cut, hospitals lost programs, and universities lost partners. That was a heavy price. But ordinary people stepped in. Volunteers ran health drives, villages pooled money for schools. That resilience is the deeper fruit of karma. Hardship can create division, or it can create unity. The people chose unity. What about us? If our towns lost something we relied on, would we come together or fall apart? For America, the mirror is sharp. Too often, we treat distant places as if they do not matter. But the cause of neglect always brings the consequence of surprise. Just as foreign powers underestimated Burkina Faso, we too risk underestimating the importance of our own local strength. What if tomorrow global markets shift? What if supply chains break? What if our children must rely more on community than on distant corporations? The karmic question is clear. Have we sown the seeds of resilience, or only the seeds of dependency? There is also a lesson of responsibility across generations. Traoré reminded his nation that independence is not a gift, but a duty. The same truth faces us at home. Freedom, safety, dignity. These are not given once and for all. They must be protected, taught, and lived. When we choose convenience over responsibility, we pass the cost to the next generation. When we choose integrity, we pass them strength. That is the moral harvest of life. So, what is the lesson for us? Sitting thousands of miles from Ouagadougou, it is simple but profound. What we sow is what we reap. A nation that sows silence will reap exploitation. A nation that sows dignity will reap sovereignty. A family that sows love will reap unity. A community that sows trust will reap safety. And if we fail to sow these things, the harvest will come anyway, but it will not be the one we want. Over the next months, Burkina Faso will continue its test. Perhaps the road will be rough. Perhaps there will be setbacks. But the seed of dignity has been planted, and seeds, once planted, tend to grow. For us, the question is not whether Africa will change. It is whether we ourselves will learn from its example. So tonight, as you sit with family or think of your grandchildren, ask, what seeds are we planting? Are we sowing patience, truth, responsibility, and dignity? Or are we letting weeds grow, hoping someone else will clear them later? Because the law of karma does not wait. It always delivers a harvest. Burkina Faso has shown us that even a small nation can change the balance of power by acting with courage. What could we change here at home if we chose courage too? That is the ultimate lesson. The cause is in our hands. The consequence belongs to the generations who follow. In Tel Aviv, panic spread. Prime Minister Netanyahu called an emergency briefing. Leaked notes revealed fear. This isn't just Burkina Faso. He's building a wall against us. Cause, covert influence. Consequence, continental rejection. Analysts called it a doctrine. But at its heart, it was karma, the fruit of decades of hidden manipulation, ripening all at once. Yet for ordinary Burkinabe, the meaning was personal. On the streets, young men waved flags, Mothers sang hymns. Students held cardboard signs. Africa is not for sale. No more shadows. It was not about anger but dignity. For too long, people felt decisions were made elsewhere, that sovereignty was a word without weight. Traoré's actions struck a deeper moral chord. If exploitation creates silence, justice creates voice. But questions lingered. Could Burkina Faso withstand retaliation? Would Western allies cut aid, freeze accounts, or sponsor unrest? Karma never ends with one turn. It continues, rippling outward. The initial act of resistance had unleashed a story larger than the nation itself. The cause was courage. The consequence, the region would soon find out. By the third day, Burkina Faso was no longer the only headline. Across Africa, newspapers spoke of the Traoré Doctrine, a phrase that carried both defiance and destiny. In marketplaces and village squares, people whispered about how one nation had dared to break invisible chains. But in Western capitals, whispers turned into alarm bells. The cause was straightforward. A young captain had chosen to act. The consequence was global unease. France, usually first to speak when its interests in Africa are challenged, remained silent. No press release, no statement of concern. That silence was itself a confession, proof that Paris understood the weight of what had been set in motion. In Washington, the tone was cautious. The State Department called for dialogue and restraint, a phrase so vague that it seemed designed to buy time. Yet behind closed doors, analysts were blunt. What happened in Ouagadougou was not just a raid, it was a direct challenge to decades of policy built on quiet compliance. On the streets of Burkina Faso, however, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds gathered outside the presidential compound not to protest, but to celebrate. Young men waved flags stitched by their grandmothers. Women sold roasted corn, turning the event into a festival. Students painted their faces with the colors of the nation. One homemade banner read, "We are not your resource. We are not your shadow." The cause was oppression. The effect was pride. In karmic balance, what had been sown in secrecy was now reaped in open solidarity. International media began to catch up. Images of embassy cars leaving under military escort flashed across screens in Europe and the US. Diplomats, once hidden behind tinted glass, were now photographed, packing their belongings. For decades, they had operated quietly. Now their departure became a spectacle, a symbol of reversal. The lesson was sharp. When you sow control through hidden contracts, you reap exposure in public daylight. But jubilation at home did not erase the risks abroad. In Tel Aviv, national security experts spoke of a crisis grid. One analyst warned that if two more African nations copied Traoré's model, Israel's operational network in West Africa could collapse entirely. In Brussels, EU ministers met behind closed doors, torn between condemnation and hesitation. They feared that if they pushed too hard, they would prove Traoré's point, that foreign powers preferred control over cooperation. Meanwhile, neighboring leaders watched closely. Mali, Niger, and Guinea began formal consultations. A domino had fallen, and the ripple was spreading. The cause was Burkina Faso's act of sovereignty. The consequence could be a continental realignment. And yet, an unspoken question lingered. Would the world act in time to stop this momentum, or had the hourglass already turned? History suggested that once people reclaim their voice, it cannot easily be silenced. But every choice has a cost. For Traoré, the price of defiance might soon arrive. The aftershocks of Traoré's actions began rippling through everyday life in Burkina Faso. Markets buzzed with conversation. Taxi drivers debated politics between fares. Farmers in dusty villages spoke with pride that their land no longer felt leased to foreign interests. The cause was a single decisive move at the top. The consequence was a shift in how ordinary citizens saw themselves, no longer passive, but guardians of their nation's destiny. But the transition was not without strain. As foreign organizations and contractors pulled out, gaps emerged. Hospitals lost certain foreign-funded programs. Universities paused partnerships. Some feared that jobs connected to outside firms would vanish. These were the real-life consequences of cutting hidden strings. Sovereignty came with both dignity and cost. Yet citizens responded with resilience. Volunteers organized local health drives. Community groups pooled funds for school supplies. The karmic equation seemed to hold. Where dependency had once bred complacency, independence now demanded self-reliance. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the civil and political effects multiplied. Mali and Niger, already partners in the Alliance of Sahel states, accelerated talks of deeper integration, shared intelligence, coordinated mining policies, and joint border patrols. For decades, the Sahel had been known as fragile, fractured, and vulnerable. Suddenly, the region appeared to be writing its own rules. The cause was unity born of defiance. The consequence was a bloc too large to ignore. For the United States, this evolution carried heavy implications. American foreign policy in Africa often rested on two pillars: counterterrorism partnerships and access to strategic resources. Burkina Faso sits at the heart of both. U.S. Africa Command had long relied on quiet cooperation from governments willing to share intelligence and allow military training. But if Traoré's doctrine spread, that foundation could weaken. The karmic balance here was unmistakable. Years of treating Africa as a junior partner had sown mistrust. Now the US risked reaping limited access just when global competition with China and Russia demanded more. Inside Washington, voices diverged. Some argued that cutting aid would pressure Traoré back into compliance. Others warned that such a move would only validate his narrative of Western exploitation. One senior analyst put it plainly: if we punish him, we prove him right. If we ignore him, we lose ground. Either way, the old playbook is finished. The cause was entrenched habits of control. The consequence was a policy trap. Meanwhile, the people of Burkina Faso continued to adapt. Gold refineries, once managed by foreign firms, now hired local engineers. Small-scale miners, often marginalized, began selling to new state-backed buyers. Families who once saw wealth leave their soil finally witnessed a glimmer of return. A teacher in Ouagadougou said it best on local radio: "For years, we gave away the fruit of our land. Now, even if it is hard, at least the harvest is ours." The karmic law was visible. When a nation reclaims its wealth, it also inherits its burdens and its pride. But storm clouds loomed. Intelligence chatter suggested attempts to destabilize the government through disinformation and covert financing of opposition groups. Jihadist movements still active in northern Burkina Faso might exploit economic disruption. Here, the ripple of cause and effect grew darker. Bold defiance could invite bold retaliation. The people had tasted dignity, but could they endure the trials that would follow? For Americans watching, the parallels felt uncomfortably close. What if their own towns suddenly depended less on distant corporations and more on community resilience? Would families rise to the challenge or fracture under pressure? Traoré's Burkina Faso posed a moral mirror. Security is not only about borders and armies, but about whether nations can bear the consequences of their choices. The cause was independence. The consequence was an untested path. In Washington, the debate grew sharper. Defense officials warned that the loss of cooperation with Burkina Faso could weaken counter-terrorism efforts across the Sahel. Economists pointed to a different concern: the shift in gold and resource control. With prices already soaring past $2,400 per ounce, Burkina Faso's decision to keep wealth inside its borders had global consequences. The cause was resource nationalism. The consequence was market turbulence. France, meanwhile, found itself cornered. For decades, French companies had enjoyed privileged access to West African gold, uranium, and oil. Now the very model of France-Afrique was unraveling. President Macron faced criticism at home for losing influence to a 37-year-old captain. Some advisors pushed for sanctions, others for diplomacy. Yet each path risked confirming Traoré's charge that foreign powers preferred domination over equality. Karma once again revealed itself. France had sown dependence. Now it was reaping rejection. Russia and China, by contrast, stepped in quickly. Russian companies offered new mining technology. Chinese envoys discussed infrastructure deals, roads, power plants, and rail. Their message was simple: we will partner, not dictate. For Burkina Faso, this meant alternatives. For the West, it meant shrinking leverage. The cause was a vacuum left by retreating powers. The effect was new players filling the space. In African capitals, reactions ranged from admiration to anxiety. Mali and Niger saw a chance for regional strength. Ghana and Senegal worried about losing Western aid. Across the continent, the question emerged: is this the dawn of sovereignty or the prelude to instability? Each government knew the karmic truth. Choices made today would yield consequences for generations. For the United States, the dilemma deepened. To ignore Burkina Faso risked losing credibility in Africa's fastest changing region. To pressure Traoré risked fueling anti-Western sentiment. Either way, Washington faced a mirror. After years of treating Africa as a chessboard, it now had to face Africa as a player. The cause was neglect. The consequence was uncertainty. And so, as embassies recalibrated and investors hesitated, one question echoed through policy circles from Paris to Washington. Is this merely a rebellion contained within Burkina Faso, or is it the start of a crisis that will reshape Africa's place in the world? As August heat settled over the Sahel, the horizon looked both hopeful and dangerous. Burkina Faso's defiance had inspired pride, yet shadows gathered at the edges. Jihadist groups remained active in the north, testing security forces with sudden raids. Rumors of covert financing for opposition politicians spread through villages. These were not coincidences. They were the predictable consequences of shaking a long-standing order. The cause was resistance. The consequence was retaliation. Yet inside Ouagadougou, determination hardened. President Ibrahim Traoré spoke to the nation, not as a distant leader, but as a soldier among citizens. He reminded families that sovereignty was not a gift, but a duty. If we want independence, he said, we must also bear responsibility. It was a karmic warning. Freedom carries weight. The harvest belongs to those who tend the field, but weeds will always return if vigilance fades. Over the next 30 to 90 days, the world will see which path Burkina Faso chooses. Will the nation stabilize its markets, strengthen alliances with Mali and Niger, and protect communities from extremist violence? Or will economic pressure and covert campaigns unravel the fragile unity? Much depends on whether the people themselves can turn pride into practical resilience, building schools, defending villages, and managing resources without waiting for foreign instructions. For the Sahel as a whole, the stakes are enormous. A successful Burkina Faso could inspire a wave of sovereignty across the continent, forcing Europe and America to accept Africa as an equal partner. A collapse, however, would confirm the skeptics who claim the region cannot stand without foreign hands. This is the moral equation, the law of cause and effect, playing out on a continental stage. And for Americans watching from afar, the lesson is closer than it seems. If your town faced the same test, less reliance on outsiders, more responsibility at home, how would your community respond? Would families pull together or drift apart? What do we owe the next generation to keep them safe? In the end, Burkina Faso's